What's up, guys? We're going to continue with our discussion on the psychosexual theory of Sigmund Freud. Maybe. And then we will kind of move on. We sort of did the intro today, and the id and all that stuff. So tonight, this video is going to be on the psychosexual stages of Sigmund Freud. As soon as this pops up. Here we go. There's that, and all right. So this is where we ended today. And we're going to move on. So the first stage in Freud's theory of psychosexual development is stage 1. This is the oral stage. This is generally birth to about 18 months. And what Freud did was he looked at babies and watched babies, how they put everything in their mouth. And even today, if we're around young kids, the kids are always putting things in their mouth. That's just how they learn. Well, Freud saw that as a source of satisfaction. Remember, again, Freud was very, I don't want to say sexually motivated, but he saw a lot of behavior through the lens of sexual gratification. And he saw this as a place where young kids found satisfaction. This is during an age of complete dependence. I mean, the kids cannot do anything on their own. They can't eat, they can't defecate, they can't drink, they can't move really without, maybe at least the first part of it, without help. So they're completely dependent on everybody. Their challenge, remember Freud talked about how each one of these stages is sort of a challenge, and they have to meet that challenge in order to move on, or if they don't, remember, they get stuck in, if they're unsuccessful, they get stuck in sort of this fixation where they have excessive gratification and frustration and can lead to an overemphasis on needs of that period. So what he's saying is if somebody does not meet this challenge or does not go past the challenge, they're going to be stuck in sort of that oral stage for the rest of their life, or they're going to have some excessive thoughts on that. Things like that. The fixation, a fixation that happens during this stage, if they don't meet that, this is where you get a lack of confidence, obsessive eating. This is also where smoking comes from, sarcasm, passive dependence, things like that. Remember, this is according to Freud in his theory. Stage 2 is what he called the anal stage. This is from months 18 to 3. And here, the source of satisfaction is the anus. This is, and what he was, I think, mostly focused on here is toilet training. And just being able to use the potty. The challenge, again, is toilet training. This is society's first effort to regulate our bodily urges. And here, the focus is on control, our ability to control our bodies, basically to hold it until the time comes where we can get to a bathroom. The fixation on this, the challenge is generally obsession with neatness. This is where the term anal retentive comes from. You hear, you talk about a person, wow, that person is really anal about this thing. Well, that is where this comes from. That pop culture reference is where that pop culture reference comes from. But neatness, being anal retentive, or messy and disorganized, anal expulsive. And a lot of times you see hostility towards women and or anxiety about sex. So, and that's the fixation that happens if there are troubles meeting the challenge in the anal stage. Again, months 18 to 3 years old. So you see there's a little bit of overlap between stage 1 and stage 2 in some cases. Stage 3 is the phallic stage. And this is where the source of, the genitals become the source of satisfaction. This is also where attachment to a parent of the opposite sex comes from, and you will get jealousy of the same sex parent. Most of us kind of remember, if we've got younger siblings, I've got some younger children during about age 3, probably not all the way to 5. It was about a year, around 3. Poor Zeke always walked around with his hands down his pants. Tatum did sort of the same, but not as much. But there's sort of a exploration there of realizing that there are genital areas that have that have a different feeling than the rest of your skin when you touch them. All right. So there's sort of an exploring of that. This is where you get the Oedipus complex in boys and the Electra complex in girls. Essentially, and this comes from the story of Oedipus, where, make a long story short, I think I've talked about it, but Oedipus ends up the killing his father and marrying his mother. And that's where the Oedipus, the idea of it comes, or at least the name of it comes from. And what happens is, according to Freud, boys have an attachment to the mother, and girls will have an attachment to the father, and actually will be jealous of, if you're a boy, you'll be jealous of your father, and if you're a girl, you'll be jealous of your mother. Freud, at the bottom, Freud once theorized every male subconsciously wants to sleep with his mom. That's completely disgusting. Freud's mom must be like 100 years old, but all right. But the idea, that's the Oedipus complex. For boys. Now, he said the girls had what's called the Electra complex and penis envy. Failure to move through this. Again, this is according to Freud, where you have improper biological identification. This is before the whole idea of gender stuff. But he says that failure to move through this phase or to meet that challenge creates improper identification and homosexuality. And the point of this right here is sort of the Electra complex, that Miley Cyrus is essentially taking the place of the mom. Starting at about 5 years old and really going to about 13 years, you have what's called the latency period. And this is where you sort of have a suppression of sexual instincts. He says that there is a natural homosexual period, and you prefer the company of same sex. This is the whole, boys have cooties, or if you're a girl, boys have cooties. If you're a boy, girls are yucky or have cooties or something. According to Freud, this is when kids are doing this, they're in the latency period. You don't have a lot of boyfriend-girlfriend things going on during this time period. Stage 4, he calls the genital period, or genital stage. This is ages 13 to 19, what we would refer to as adolescence, where you all are right here, right now. And this is where you get the maturation of sexual desires and relationships. So those are the stages, the stages of Freud's psychosexual stages. Now, when we evaluate, looking back at it now, obviously some of it seems kind of far out there. And even then, when he developed these, there's a lot of people that just, this was way too much for them to handle, even in the scientific community. Some of the issues or some of the evaluations that we have of Freud now include we know unconscious can influence behaviors, especially early childhood, how it can influence adult personality, but there's really no scientific evidence of this. This was all based on observational evidence that Freud did when he was doing his private practice, when people would come to him with some of these psychological problems. And these were sort of just based on his observations. There's very little academic evidence that really supports any of Freud's ideas. It's just all observation. One of the other issues that is very male-centered. Of course, at the time, it was a very male-dominated society. And, of course, Freud himself, being a male, found it difficult to, I guess, associate with some of the issues of women. And then the idea of penis envy and castration anxiety, themes like that, it just in reality, it's kind of a sweat. It's kind of a stretch for all this. Again, here's an example and sort of a breakdown of the 5 stages. Again, oral, pleasures in the mouth, sucking, biting, chewing. Again, this is where he saw babies always putting stuff in their mouths. Anal pleasures on the bowel and bladder, elimination, coping with demands for control. I've got to control. I got to hold it till I can get to a bathroom. Phallic stage, 3 to 6, pleasure zone is the genitals, coping, with incestuous sexual relationships, things like the Electra complex and the Oedipus complex. Latency, sexual feelings sort of die down. Again, this is all according to Freud. And then, of course, in the genital stage is when you have a maturation of sexual interests. We've already talked about this. This is just sort of a review of the Oedipus complex, a boy's sexual desire toward his mother and feelings of jealousy and hatred towards the father who he sees as a rival, and the same thing with the Electra with the girls and the mother. Identification, child copes and represses such feelings and begins to identify with the rival parent, and again, with a fixation during this time, strong conflict within a stage would lock a person in that stage until they can break out of it. Now, to me, what's a little more interesting is Freud's and his defense mechanisms. Basically how somebody deals with the stuff coming up from the id, right? Coping methods, unconscious defense against unpleasant emotions. The purpose of these are to avoid anxiety. Anxiety is being uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, and one's consciousness create anxiety. We talked about that today as we were talking about the id and things like that. When the id threatens to get out of control, that's when anxiety is created. And then you've got defense mechanisms help protect your conscious mind by reducing or avoiding it. The defense mechanism is actually pushing those things down into the subconscious, where, remember, we don't have access to it. If you have an overactive ID, sort of the overwhelming, or id, sorry. An overactive id, the overriding question is, can I control myself? And there's a lot of early psychological studies on serial killers and things like that talked about an overactive id and being able to control oneself, or the lack of ability to control oneself. Then he said if you have an overactive superego, these people generally have an overabundance of guilt. We know, these people know that they have these urges, and they are guilty in the fact that they have these urges. So one of the first things is repression. Anxiety-invoking thoughts, memories are pushed into the unconscious. These are also sexual desires and childhood traumas. This is motivated forgetting. We purposefully forget these things so they don't sort of creep up into our consciousness and unconscious, so they don't creep up into our consciousness. So that's repression. Denial is a little different. This is refusing to acknowledge that there's even an issue. This happens with things that have been especially painful or have high anxiety. Producing info, and here's a kind of a funny example. I am a lemon. This orange is in denial. Obviously, it is not a lemon. It is an orange. Another defense mechanism is projection. This is attributing one's own acceptable impulses, qualities onto somebody else. You see this a lot on. I think I see this. You see this manifesting itself sometimes on Facebook, which I'm not going to get into. But things you don't like about yourself, things that you know are unacceptable. People will tend to push those or see those in other people and sort of bring them out. And you're doing all this, you're wrong, you're a bad person, even though that may be something within themselves that they may or may not realize. And then rationalization. This is creating acceptable, logical reasons for the things that otherwise would produce anxiety or would not be acceptable. You know what? I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't think of a good example. Maybe you all can. Of people will, an example where people will create reasons, and they're logical reasons for things that would produce anxiety and would not be acceptable. I failed the MCAT, but I never really wanted to be a doctor anyways. All right, that's a rationalization. Or I struck out, but I don't really like softball. Or it's almost like making an excuse, if that makes sense. And this one's even a bit more national. We invaded Iraq because we thought Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. All right, that is a rationalization. And of course, this is when Bill Clinton was in his sex scandal. Depends on what your definition of sex is. Another defense mechanism is displacement. This is redirect undesirable motives from the original source to another. All right, bell just rang. I got to get to my spot, but tomorrow we will continue with these defense mechanisms. All right. Hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Maybe. Now it won't stop. I'll edit this out, hopefully, end show. There we go.